بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والحمد لله رب العالمين وصلوات ربي وسلامه على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم وبعد. To continue inshallah with Al-Muhadhab min Ihya Ulumuddin, the Muhadhib being Al-Sheikh Salih Al-Shami حفظه الله تعالى ورحمه حيا أو ميتا, and the Imam, of course, the Asl being by Hujjatul Islam Abu Hamid Al-Ghazali rahimahullah ta'ala wa radiya an. And we stopped prior to the break at the fifth point in relation to Asrar al-Sawmi wa shurutihi al-batina, so the inner issues of fasting and what we should be reflecting upon and taking into consideration, and how we should try to acquire a proper outcome from fasting through these elements. And the secret of all of this is in the ayah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا كُتِبَ عَلَيْكُمُ الصِّيَامُ كَمَا كُتِبَ عَلَى الَّذِينَ مِنْ قَبْلِكُمْ لَعَلَّكُمْ تَتَّقُونَ. So the acquirement of taqwa. So the point here is how to acquire taqwa. And I'm not going to recap just because we want to start to cover a bit more of the book inshallah bi'idhnillah. Otherwise we will get to the end and Batuhan still won't have a license, so it's going to be online for forever. So al-khamis, he says ألا يستكثر من الطعام الحلال وقت الإفطار بحيث يمتلئ جوفه فما من وعاء أبغض إلى الله عز وجل من بطن ملئ من حلال. وكيف يستفاد من الصوم قهر عدو الله وكسر الشهوة إذا تدارك الصائم عند فطره ما فاته ضحوة نهاره. So we covered this part last time, and basically Imam Al-Ghazali rahimahullah ta'ala, he's saying in order to benefit from the fasting is that a person should not overeat. He should not overeat. And he says, what's the point in fasting? And then at the end of the day, you make up for that which you've missed by eating as much as possible. And then he mentions there is not a utensil that is more disliked and hated to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala than the stomach that has been filled with halal. And this is a point to reflect upon. He says there is no utensil which is more disliked and hated to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala than the stomach filled with halal. And today what do we say? We fill our stomachs, we fill our pockets, we overconsume, and we say it's halal. And if anyone tells us, no, you shouldn't engage in this type of behavior, don't indulge, we say extreme. Let us live, let us enjoy the dunya, it's halal. Don't be extreme, don't make things difficult. But this is the wrong mentality. And if you keep consuming halal, 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 what happens? If you don't say no to the halal, what's going to happen? You're going to fall into haram. And that's what's happening today. Gluttony, perversion of desire, perversion of the desire of the private parts and the stomachs. That's what's happening. And a very simple example, one that may have been given previously, and it sounds very silly, but it's an image that shows what's happening to our desires. A simple food such as we said, the burger. It started with a piece of meat and 2 buns. But what's happened? We become bored with the simple burger. Why? Overindulgence, overeating. We want more. Instead of saying no, suffice yourself with that which is simple, we want more. What happens? Add extra burgers into it. Add various types of cheese. Add various types of ingredients. And now pour cheese over the burger. It's not inside the burger, it's on top now. You have individuals that are now putting sweets inside burgers. Why? What is it? This is called perversion. And it might sound like a silly example, but say the same about the desire of, and forgive me again for the crudeness, but the desire of the private parts. Same thing is happening, where it's overindulgence. A person becomes bored with that which is normal because they're overindulging. And with the overstimulation of our time due to digital media, it's happening to many people. Many are unable to have a healthy marriage now because of they are overstimulated by their smart devices. And for this reason, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us fasting to teach us to say no to ourselves. And this should be a practice, a daily practice for the Muslim. The Muslim should say no to himself more than he says yes to himself. That's taqwa, to say no more than I say yes to myself. Just because I have food in the house doesn't mean I should eat it. Just because I have money doesn't mean I should spend it. Just because I have an abundance of whatever it is that I like doesn't mean that I should indulge in it. No. But why is it that we don't live such a lifestyle? Because we have become conditioned by a capitalist philosophy. A capitalist philosophy. The more you consume, the better it is for the economy. The more you consume, the happier you are going to be. We correlate between the material indulgences and our personal happiness. And that's not the case. It's not the case at all. And in fact, there are statistics that show there is in fact a correlation between depression and suicide and mental health disorders and abundance of wealth. The suicide rates in the Western world are far higher than in the Eastern world. They're far higher in first world countries than they are in third world countries. But you would think it should be the opposite. A person who's struggling to feed his family. No. The one who has an abundance of wealth is the one who is closer to suicide than the one who has a lack of wealth. Why? Overindulgence. What does it do to the soul? What does it do to the heart? And this is something we have to understand. We have to grasp as Muslims. Halal is also haram if I overindulge. If I'm eating out every day, I'm sinning. I'm sinning if I'm eating out every day. Why? Because I'm spending wealth that I should not be spending. If I am earning, let's say, £2,000 a month, and I'm spending £100 on a meal, that's israf. It's israf. And that's what's happening today. And especially the young, the youth. I have a £30,000 car, but yet I'm living in a council estate. I have 800, 900, £1,000 coat, but I'm living in a council estate. That's israf. It's israf. And this is haram. It's haram for us to indulge in the dunya in this way. And if we don't stop, then we're going to fall into haram. And we have to understand and reflect. And today you find young students of knowledge, young reciters of the Quran, young worshippers, etc., and they're falling into crazy types of haram. Why? Because we have secularized the deen. The deen has become ritualistic and academic. It's ritualistic and academic. As for the spiritual side of the deen, it's lacking, it's missing. What's the spiritual side of the deen? What does the spiritual side of the deen come down to? Saying no to the self and developing your character. That's the spirituality of Islam. Saying no to yourself and developing your character. That's basically what it comes down to. And that's missing. Today, you will have a person who prays in the front row, obnoxious, arrogant, and rude. Where's the akhlaq of the Prophet ﷺ? You're in the front row, where's your character? You have an Imam, and he doesn't have time for people. You have a Qari of the Quran, and he's taking people's money. You have a young student of knowledge, and he's engaging in behavior which is illicit and inappropriate online and offline. Why? Because the spirituality has been separated from the deen. We've secularized Islam, and we've turned it into an academic arena, where you have a person who's debating about intricate issues of Islam online, and offline he's smoking. Offline he's engaging in haram. You have people singing about Allah and His Messenger ﷺ, and yet they're falling into fornication. How is that? How can that be possible? And what's worse than this is and forgive me if I'm making a word up here, the ethnicization of Islam, where Islam has become, it's an ethnic practice. I'm Muslim because of it's an ethnic culture to be Muslim. For example, I'm from a certain part of Africa where Muslims there, therefore praying is a part of my ethnic culture. I'm from Bangladesh or Pakistan or from Egypt or Morocco, and so therefore I pray because it's my culture. Ethnically, I'm a Muslim. But as for religiously, there's no Islam there. There's no Islam. And so you'll see a person who's praying 5 times a day, and yet they're engaged in riba. Praying 5 times a day, fornicating on the weekend. Praying 5 times a day, selling and consuming alcohol. Why? Because Islam is an ethnic practice. It's a culture. And so what the Imam here is talking about when he's talking about not overeating relates to all of this. Because not overeating is a conscious decision. You're saying no to yourself. Why? To please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Perhaps a tangent, but they're needed sometimes. Then he says, وَرُبَّمَا يَزِيدُ عَلَيْهِ مِنْ أَلْوَانِ الطَّعَامِ. And so look at what he's saying. And look, this is 1,000 years ago. 1,000 years ago, roughly. Imam al-Ghazali rahimahullah ta'ala is saying this. He says, how is it possible that a person is going to benefit from fasting and he's going to succumb the enemy shaitan if he's overeating? He's overeating. And how does shaitan enter into man? Through his desire. He says, and what we find now, he's talking about in his time, is that people increase in Ramadan with various types of food that they don't eat outside of Ramadan. حتى استمرت العادات بأن تدخر جميع الأطعمة لرمضان فيؤكل من الأطعمة فيه ما لا يؤكل في عدة شهور. He says, and it has become the practice now that certain foods are preserved. They're only cooked and made in Ramadan. And so in Ramadan, he eats such a collection of food that he doesn't eat outside of Ramadan. Is that not what we do today? Isn't that what we do today? And if we're going to be honest about it, iftar parties, Ramadan is a month of ibadah, but yet a person is wasting their time going to iftar parties where it's lots of food that gets wasted. People are too full up to pray. The deen is a deen. It's yes, we should enjoy ibadah, but it's become excessive. It's become excessive now. And so we have to be very careful. And how can you see the excessiveness creeping in, the capitalization, the commodification of Islam? What's happening? You have big supermarkets that have Ramadan aisles now. You have big clothing chains that sell Eid clothes. Why? Because they've caught on. Let's catch on. Let's utilize this moment. And even when it comes to buying presents for Eid, buying presents is a positive, especially for children. Why? Because we want them to remember Ramadan with significance. When they think back, they enjoy Ramadan, they have good times, good memories. But if I'm spending hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of pounds, thousands of pounds on presents, and it's becoming a pressure for me, it's becoming difficult for me, then it beats the purpose of Ramadan, especially since Ramadan is about giving to the poor, not overindulging on those who don't need it, including our own children. And then he says, وَمَعْلُومٌ أَنَّ مَقْصُودَ الصَّوْمِ الْخَوَاء وَكَسْرُ الْهَوَى لِتَقْوَى النَّفْسِ عَلَى التَّقْوَى. He says it's very well known that the purpose behind fasting is to empty yourself, not to fill yourself, and to break your desire, not indulge in your desire. Why? So that you can strengthen yourself and you can overcome the nafs. And this point here, al-khawa, this is a point which is again important, and it was a practice of the earlier scholars of Islam, the awliya, the ubbad, to abstain from eating as much as possible. Why? Because and you can try it. The less that you eat, the softer your heart is. You will find your heart is softer the less that you eat. Now, we're not saying you go to extremes. We're not saying you go to extremes. But if you struggle to cry when you raise your hands to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, perhaps your heart is hardened by the indulgence in the dunya. And the salaf, the khalaf, the ulama, the awliya, they have spoken at length about this issue, the softening of the heart. And the softening of the heart comes from abstaining from eating and abstaining from talking too much. Abstaining from eating and abstaining from talking too much. But we cannot go from 100 miles per hour to 0 miles per hour. we live in a very social society. We are very sociable in modern societies. We talk a lot. So it doesn't mean that I just completely cut off. No. But there should be time where I spend that time alone. I don't engage in too much talk. And when I am talking, I should be conscious of what I'm saying and what other people are saying. And then he says, فروح الصوم وسره تضعيف القوى التي هي وسائل الشيطان في العود إلى الشرور ولا يحصل ذلك إلا بالتقليد وهو أن يأكل أكلته التي كان يأكلها كل ليلة لو لم يصم فأما إذا جمع ما كان يأكل ضحوة إلى ما كان يأكل ليلا فلم ينتفع بصومه. He says the secret behind fasting and behind strengthening yourself through fasting is by weakening your desire. And weakening your desire comes by lessening the amount that you eat. And so you will not benefit from Ramadan if you eat too much. Why? Because you are going to end up giving shaitan an entrance to take you back to the desire that you're trying to run away from. And then he says, ومن الآداب ألا يكثر النوم بالنهار حتى يحس بالجوع والعطش ويستشعر ضعف القوة فيصفو عند ذلك قلبه ويخف عليه تهجده وأوراده فعسى الشيطان ألا يحوم على قلبه. And so now he adds another element. And this is another element for us to consider, especially the young, especially young brothers, young sisters. He says, and from the adab, the etiquettes of fasting, is that a person does not sleep too much. Why? Because he should feel the hunger and feel the thirst and feel the weakness of his body. There is benefit in that. And when that takes place, what happens? The heart becomes pure. Yasfu al-qalb. The heart becomes pure. It becomes soft. It becomes detoxed, spiritually detoxed. But if a person is staying awake all night, praying Taraweeh, and then going and having a massive meal at a restaurant with friends or whatever it might be, then staying up all night, and then praying Fajr and sleeping, waking up praying Zuhr, sleeping, waking up praying Asr, sleeping, waking up at Maghrib, having his iftar, and again the cycle continues. What benefit is that? There's no benefit in that. There's benefit for the person that hasn't been praying his entire life. Alhamdulillah, you're praying 5 times a day. But as for the person who is praying normally, there's no benefit in that. A person can sleep, of course, an hour, 2, etc., if you're not sleeping much at night time, but we should limit the amount of hours that we sleep. And today, there are hours that are put out there. How much should a person sleep?
Say like 7 to 8 hours, isn't it?
Huh? Yeah, they say 7 to 8 hours. What, do you really need 7 to 8 hours to sleep? Of sleep, do you really need that? 7 to 8 hours? Especially if you're young. And so we should try to limit the amount of sleep that we have. It doesn't mean that we are going to be extreme with it. Half an hour every night, an hour every... No. Try to limit the amount that you sleep. If your body needs 7 hours, it needs 7 hours, then 7 hours should be the maximum. If you can go less, 5 hours, then go less. 5 or 6 hours. And remember, we live in a all of these statements, I believe they backtracked on it now, that a person needs 2 liters of water every day. Now they've said no, a person doesn't actually need 2 liters of water every day. A person needs 7 to 8 hours of sleep. And they say something like, if you don't get the right amount of sleep, it decreases from your life. So how were humans living century after century after century? The Prophet ﷺ, he mentioned that the age range of his ummah is a particular age range. The awliya of the past, they would sleep very little and they lived long lives. Likewise, water. How is it possible a person who doesn't have running water is drinking 2 liters of water a day, 3 meals a day? How is it possible centuries ago that people were eating 3 meals a day the way that we eat? These things weren't possible. And so we should take these modern concepts with a pinch of salt. And the best way is the way of the Prophet ﷺ, and then the way of the Sahaba. And the Prophet ﷺ, he didn't eat 3 times a day. He didn't drink 2 liters of water a day. He didn't sleep 7 to 8 hours a day. And we have a role model. And the Prophet ﷺ, he's not a role model simply in so-called Islamic issues. No, he is a role model in the way that he lived. In the way that he lived. To the degree that some of the ulama, they mention that the Prophet ﷺ was impoverished, therefore being impoverished is the best way to live. Why? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chose the best circumstance for the best of creation. Does it mean that we should aspire to be impoverished? No. But we should not accept these modern concepts without comparing them and utilizing our framework to ascertain whether or not they are correct or incorrect. And then he says, السادس and if he doesn't sleep too much, doesn't eat too much, he says that bi'idhnillah, shaitan will not be orbiting around his heart. But if he oversleeps and overeats, what's going to happen? Shaitan is close. Shaitan has a door. Shaitan will tempt him. And when you think about it, when you're fasting and it's hot, what are you thinking about through the day? Are you thinking about food? You're not. You're thinking about what? Quenching your thirst. After you've quenched your thirst, then what do you think about? Food. After you've eaten something, then what do you think about? Then comes the other desires. Then comes the other desires. And so by leaving off the halal, you leave a buffer zone between sin or between other aspects of halal. And just as we're on the point of saying no to the self, Imam Ghazali rahimahullah ta'ala, he even goes so far as to say that a man should control the amount of times that he is intimate with his wife. Why? So that he does not become dependent upon intimacy. To that extent. That just because a man has the opportunity to be intimate with his wife as much as he wants, it does not mean that he should engage in that. Rather, he should abstain and learn to say no to the self, even in issues that are halal and that are difficult to abstain from, such as the desire for intimacy. Why? So that he does not become dependent upon it. That's the way the awliya of the past were thinking. But again, we have to take these approaches with moderation. With moderation. Why? Because we live in a completely different time zone. And we cannot apply the same model as Imam al-Ghazali rahimahullah ta'ala in our time. It's nearly impossible. Why? Because of the society around us. Except for those whom Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grants tawfiq, and they are very few, and it takes a long time to get there, and dedication. It's not overnight. And then he says, عن الحسن البصري أنه مر بقوم وهم يضحكون. That Al-Hasan al-Basri, he was passing by some people. Oh, sorry, I missed. He said, السادس أن يكون قلبه بعد الإفطار معلقا مضطربا بين الخوف والرجاء إذ ليس يدري أيقبل صومه فهو من المقربين أم يرد عليه فهو من الممقوتين وليكن كذلك في آخر كل عبادة يفرغ منها. And he gives a general rule here. He says that likewise, whilst fasting, his heart should be in a state of changing between hopeful and fearful. Why? Because he doesn't know whether or not his fasting is going to be accepted from him, nor does he know whether or not his fasting is going to be rejected. And so he hopes that it's accepted and he fears that it's rejected. So his heart is in between hope and fear. And then he says, and likewise, he should be in this state with all of his acts of worship. And so when a person finishes his prayer, what state should his heart be in? His heart should be in a state of hope and fear. I hope that it was accepted by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but I'm fearful there's a possibility that it's going to be rejected. But there are two extremes in this issue. The extreme of completely being lax and assuming that Allah has accepted everything and not really concerned with the state of my worship. The other extreme is being over concerned to the degree that it becomes a religious OCD. And this is very damaging. Shaitan will try to get you on either side of the spectrum. And so what approach should you have? فَاتَّقُوا اللَّهَ مَا اسْتَطَعْتُمْ. Fear Allah to the best of your ability. Allahu Akbar, I start my prayer. If I notice my heart is moving away from remembering Allah, I bring it back. Every time I notice I've drifted away from salah in my mind, in my heart, I bring my heart back. I don't say to myself, I need to repeat it now. No. I gradually, if I have concentration for 1% of the salah, I work towards making it 2%. I work towards making it 3%. Even if it takes 10 years, if it takes 10 years of salah, and after 10 years for 50% of my salah, I am concentrating on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, alhamdulillah, that's a major achievement. Major achievement. Some of the ulama, they said, we worked on our hearts for 20 years. 20 years. And we today, you have a young person starts practicing, or young in Islam starts practicing, and they expect to acquire khushu' and khashya in a week or two, in a year or two. It doesn't matter whether you've memorized the Quran, whether you've memorized a hadith, whether you have all of the books of Islam in your mind. We're talking about something completely different now. Al-ilm and al-khashya and al-khushu' are separate. They're separate. And so you may be a scholar when it comes to your knowledge, but when it comes to your ibadah, it takes time, it takes practice. You can have all of the theory when it comes to nutrition, working out, building your body, building your muscles. But when you step in the gym, is it going to help you? No, it's about practice. If you haven't been lifting the weights, you don't have the muscles to go the distance. And so you have to build up. But you have the information and the knowledge of how to build yourself up correctly. Likewise in Islam, you acquire the knowledge, you have the knowledge now. Now you have to put it into practice. It takes time. It takes time. And this is something which is very important, because there are many people now suffering from religious OCDs, where they have to repeat their wudu, they have to repeat their ghusl, they have to repeat their salah, they have to repeat the recitation of the Quran. They start to question, am I still a Muslim? Because I had a bad thought. I need to say the shahada again. No, all of this is from shaitan. All of this is from shaitan. Hit the sea with your stick and let Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala part the water. We are not made responsible by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for the outcome. We are responsible for the input. That's it. Allah has asked us to hit the stick, and as for parting the sea, that is Allah's responsibility in all situations. And so I focus on the input. As for the output, that's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's responsibility. The same way with the victory of our ummah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has not charged us with the outcome, i.e. we are not responsible for the victory or lack of victory for our ummah. We are responsible for the input, and Allah has given us the formula. If the input is correct, if the formula is followed, Allah will give us our victory. If the input is not correct, if the formula is not correct, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give us our loss. And so if we look to the state of the ummah today, and our ummah is at a loss, then we have to assess ourselves and look at the input and look at the formula that we're following. It's very simple. Likewise in our everyday lives. As the ulama of the past, they said, I would see the impact of my sin upon my relationship with my spouse. I step into the home and my spouse is mistreating me. Immediately, I think to myself, have I disobeyed Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala today? Because they attached everything to Allah. And then he says, عن الحسن البصري أنه مر بقوم وهم يضحكون فقال إن الله عز وجل جعل شهر رمضان مضمارا لخلقه يستبقون فيه لطاعته فسبق قوم ففازوا وتخلف أقوام فخابوا. Al-Hasan al-Basri rahimahullah ta'ala, he passed by a group of people in Ramadan and he found them to be laughing. And he said, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has placed this month of Ramadan an arena for those who want to compete for His pleasure to compete. And so you find some, they are ahead of others in this race, and others, they are behind and they are missing out in this race. And then he says, فَالْعَجَبُ كُلُّ الْعَجَبِ لِلضَّاحِكِ اللَّاعِبِ فِي الْيَوْمِ الَّذِي فَازَ فِيهِ السَّابِقُونَ. He says, and so it's so strange to find that you have people who have lost. They've lost this race. And they are behind those who are winning, and they're in a state of laughing and entertaining themselves. He said, أما والله لو كشف الغطاء لاشتغل المحسن بإحسانه والمسيء بإساءته. He said, by Allah, if the veil was revealed, was lifted, i.e., we could see into the akhirah, the muhsin, the one who has done well in this race, i.e., in the arena of Ramadan, would be busied by the pleasures of that which he has achieved, and the loser would be overcome by his loss and would be busied by his loss and his regret and his grief. And say the same about the dunya. Say the same about the dunya. When we step outside, how many are laughing and entertaining their days away? But they are slowly but surely walking towards their judgment. As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Alhaakum at-takathur. At-takathur has distracted you and destroyed you. Hatta zurtumul maqabir, until you reach the graves. Kalla sawfa ta'lamun. You are going to know. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us. And then he gives a bit of an explanation about this past part. We arrive at the next section, صحة الصوم عند الفقهاء. He says, فإن قلت فمن اقتصر على كف شهوة البطن والفرج وترك هذه المعاني فقد قال الفقهاء صومه صحيح فما معناه. So he asks a question about the authenticity or the validation of the fasting person in accordance to the fuqaha, who say that the one who abstains from the desire and consumption of the stomach and private part, his sawm is accepted. What does this mean? And so we'll leave that for next week, inshallah, as I believe it's been about half an hour. So we'll leave it for next week, inshallah. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad.